Thank you, Margaret. Terry set me up with that, the segue. I'm going to say it at the end, but this is, as you all know, this is a pretty large topic. We're going to dive into a chunk of it, and hopefully that will lead to a lot of conversations about all the other chunks. Which hat I'm wearing, Scotty just described a couple of the hats, and I put them up here specifically with regards to trying to convey that I'm involved in both sides. So the training, the educator piece is sort of how do you teach judgment and decision making. 2 nails, right? It's terrifying. And then the working guide piece is what I see happening out there. And of course, I'm a sample size of 1, so it's strictly anecdotal. But I put that up there because this is my general perception of what's happening. And this is, of course, you could also talk about recreational backcountry travelers, but for tonight, I'm going to focus on professionals, very specifically. So for tonight, what I'd like to do is really have this as the framework. I think a lot of you will have seen some of this, maybe not all, but for everyone in this room, the goal is to really sort of look at this and reflect on what might be going on here. Because I've got some ideas, but I'm one person. I'd like to hear from you all a little as well. So this is that core thing. And you know, my focus on judgment and decision making, boom, there's an availability bias. I think that's why there's this disconnect between what we are teaching and what people are doing. So I'm just going to flag that as a bias. But what I'd like to talk about tonight is how some of these cognitive biases, I see them manifesting just from personal experience and a few ideas about what's going on there. And I'm going to talk about 2 folks, Kahneman and Taleb. How many folks have read or tried to read some of Daniel Kahneman? Just to try to read is kind of a key piece, right? It's kind of, I do like this annual reattempt to make it all the way through the book, basically. And that is Thinking Fast and Slow. And then how many have run into Nassim Taleb? That's the Black Swan. That one is actually, you will be the person on the bus laughing out loud if you listen to that. So he writes, again, he is sort of the like sarcastic economist. Kahneman is the scientific economist. So I'm going to talk about those 2, and there are many other. So I'll start with Kahneman, and I put the date on there because this book was published in 2011. It's 2018, and I feel like that disconnect of like what's going on. You know, it's like you're looking out, you're like, I read the results of the surveys, and you're like, what's happening? What's happening out there? So 2011 was a while ago now. What that book was, just for reference, is basically a summary of 35 years of his and other folks' research. Economic focus, that's where funding comes from, right? He won the Nobel Prize in economics for this stuff. But he summarizes not only his own and his partner's work, but also a bunch of other folks in the field, which was why I try and have the annual rereading of this book, because if you're going to have one source, there's a lot of things in there. So I want to do a quick review of System 1 and System 2, and with many hand-waving and disclaimers of like, there is so much more to unpack in that, hence the annual rereading. But for our purposes, when I was listening to this on tape, driving across the western states the first time, I was like almost crashing the car because I wanted to write stuff down. Because what he's describing is this idea of how you make decisions. And he calls them System 1 and System 2 so that the clarity of language is there, so that they won't get confused with the ways that people make decisions described by other folks. So System 1, he describes its characteristics. System 2, he describes its characteristics. Everybody's got both. Right? That's what's happening in their brains. So System 1 is the ultimate associative machine. That is the way that your brain looks at all the information that it took in for your entire life without asking you and comes to a conclusion. It looks for memories, it finds associations for the current input, and that's how it makes decisions. And it does so very quickly. It does so very easily. So cognitive ease, it happens like that. You're not even thinking about it, right? You can be doing other stuff. It's very quick. It is that intuitive, and it can be impulsive decision-making system. So that is System 1, and that is, you know, you can go into kind of why and how and where. And Kahneman really focuses on the characteristics of these processes that your brain is using, and then goes from there for the implications. So we have that system one. He goes on to sort of describe if you're uncertain about something, you're trying to make a decision, system one checks memory, comes up with an answer, and that answer is guided by your experience, right? So it looks, sees what's there, it's based on experience. Is that, no, that's not me. That's not at all distracting, right? It's like if somebody walks in with a shot ski. At least it's intermittent, totally. So the thing about system one, Kahneman goes on, is jumping to conclusions is efficient if the conclusions are likely to be correct, and if the costs of an occasional mistake are acceptable. The ice just got a little thin, right? And if the jump saves much time and effort. So think about as Avalanche professionals. First one, if it's likely to be correct, that's what we want. Last one, if the jump saves time and effort, that's what we want. Second one, crap, right? So if you're having that system doing all of your decision making, the cost of an occasional mistake may not be acceptable. It might be acceptable if you're trying to figure out what to order when someone else is talking to you at the same time, as you're trying to order your food, any of those other smaller decisions. So system one comes up with the best possible story that incorporates the stuff in your brain that's already activated. So the things that you've accessed recently or have accessed powerfully. But it does not and cannot allow for information it doesn't have. So if your experience doesn't lend counsel to the decision you were trying to make, system one is going to come up with a bad idea. It's going to give you bad advice. So he also comes up with this thing, which just cracks me up. What you see is all there is. And he gives it a six-letter acronym? 7, right? And this, like you look around, you read this book, and then all of a sudden you see this shit everywhere. So people make decisions assuming that what they see is all there is to use to make that decision. We do this all the time. So what you see is all there is. That system one is that way because that's how it works. It looks into your memory, and it can only draw information from what you have experienced. So let's transition a little bit over to system two. You'll notice I spent more time on system one. System two is this effortful, the cognitive reasoning. And the idea that Kahneman poses is that system one comes up with the ideas, the thoughts and the actions very quickly. System two monitors and decides actions based on stuff that was suggested by system one. So these two ways that we make decisions are very much connected to each other. So system two takes effort. This one cracks me up because Kahneman also talks about all the cognitive effort studies that they've done, which is like, can you solve logic problems when you're hungry? Hint, no, right? So in the backcountry, you definitely should have like gummy bears on hand if you're going to make good decisions. That's what I concluded after reading the book. So cognitive effort, it takes effort, and we run out of effort. So effort is also, by the cognitive behavioral people, that's a finite resource. If someone asks you if you want fries and you're trying not to eat fries, you say no the first time. They ask you again, you say no the second time. Third time, you cave. You run out of the effort of will, right? It's a thing. I'm telling you, it's hilarious. So system two takes effort, and you will run out of that effort. So you have to account for that. It is capable of reasoning. It is the process-based, the logical. It is cautious, right? It takes an effort of will, and it takes self-control, and both of those are in finite supply. So it's also slow, and because it takes an effort of will, it's lazy. Lazy is a nice way to say that it's efficient with when it deploys itself. So you have this other way of going through decision making, but it has its own kind of limitations. So when we translate this into our decision making with Avalanche Hazard, sort of this idea of system one gets called intuition and vice versa. And I just want to talk about it a little bit. There's sort of quotes all over the place about intuition, but this one, it's nothing more and nothing less than recognition. That's the thing I said at the beginning. Your brain looks into memory, it looks for things that are similar, and it gives you an answer quickly. That's how we survived when you're getting chased by a tiger, all that kind of evolutionary biology the theory, and officially I don't know what I'm talking about when I talk about evolutionary biology. So Kahneman's version of this was the situation provides a cue. The cue gives the expert access to information stored in memory, and that info provides the answer. That's how our system one serves us very, very well. The problem is it has limitations, right? It has blind spots. So the what you see is all there is thing, like the classic example is I grew up in my backcountry life in the Pacific Northwest, maritime snowpack, storm slab, wind slab, right? So I have terrain memory. I have my I don't like the looks of that, intuitive terrain memory built in a maritime snowpack. I now go to a continental snowpack. Any of that intuitive is potentially straight up wrong because all of the input is on a whole different context. So if I'm relying on my 15 years of experience in a context that doesn't apply to the moment I'm standing in, then I have a pretty major blind spot if that's the only thing I'm relying on. So that's Kahneman's system one cannot provide guidance for situation outside its experience. It's a thing when we train mountain guides, people come out and they're like, I have all the skills, I can make the same decisions as everybody else who has the same training as me. It's like terrifying. If you go to a new area with all your training and expect to make the same decisions as the people who live there day in and day out for the entire winter, the people who have intuitive memory based in that place, and you've never been there before, and you come in thinking that your intuition is going to be accurate, you're opening yourself up to some errors with some pretty serious consequences. So the classic example, more on this photo later, but deep slab problem in the Pacific Northwest. Folks don't know what to do about it, right? When that happens, the forecasting center, they are jumping up and down trying to explain because folks it's not part of the regular info. We'll come back to that picture. So the sort of question of well, if intuition isn't good, what the hell is there's a little bit of a cultural thing where experts make good decisions because they have experience. It's well, let's look at what that means by experience. So Kahneman and others tell us that in order to build intuition, you need immediate feedback, right then. Immediate, not over 5 years. You decide to ski something, it slides or doesn't slide. So how often does that happen with avalanche hazard? There's an expression in programming, it's kind of nerdy. If you set up a model and your inputs aren't accurate, garbage in, garbage out, right? So intuition, we don't get good input most of the time. We may have thought there was an avalanche problem in a place and we didn't trigger it. And the input we get is oh, that wasn't there. Even though we might think it was there, but we just didn't trigger it. What our brain stores is it wasn't there. So we should be suspicious of that intuition as our way to figure stuff out. Okay, it's a little sobering thought, but moving into the black swan. So one piece is okay, Kahneman says system one, system two. This is how we make decisions. Again, Taleb has there's a lot in here to unpack and it's way easier to listen to when you're hiking or skiing uphill, not an avalanche terrain. But so his main focus again is economic, and he got famous because he was he basically, and I don't know the side of the finance sort of machinations well enough, but he was trading high before the big crash in the 80s, before Black Friday, and he called it before it happened. And he pulled all his people out, and then he wrote a book about why. And so his whole deal is the black swan. The reason it's called that is I think in Australia there's black swans. Europe thinks that swans are only white. At some point they make it to Australia and they're no shit, the swan's black. So it's outside of your realm of experience, right? So highly improbable events that are not within our ability to predict them. That's kind of his focus. And my whole, again, as I'm listening to him, I'm just oh my gosh, there's an analogy here for our situation. Some of the time, not all of the time. So here we are teaching or learning or using these tools for decision making. Some days, not all, we're operating in a very complex environment. So how do we protect ourselves against events that are outside our ability to predict them? You want to talk about goal-oriented, right? Our goal as professionals is to predict the events. And one of Taleb's point is like, yo, humans, you might think you're super smart, but there are going to be situations where you will not be able to accurately predict. The best thing you can do is identify when those are happening and build in margins and stop being overconfident jerks. So he talks about two places, imaginary places, Mediocristan and Extremistan. I'm telling you, the book is classic. So, and these places have characteristics. And it's really interesting to sort of like, on a given day, just be like, where am I living today? Am I in Mediocristan or am I in Extremistan? So Mediocristan is a place where things are a bit predictable. Past events can be used to, all the sort of probability forecasting can be relatively accurate. So you can forecast them. It's easy to predict from what you see and to extrapolate, to extend to what you don't see. Single variables don't cause much change in that whole picture. And the example he gives there is like, if you have a population of 1,000 people and you're trying to figure out average height for that population, if everybody is somewhere between 5 and 6 feet and you've got one person who is like 9 feet tall, it doesn't change much for the population, right? Now take a group of 1,000 people and you're trying to calculate average wealth, and one of those people is Bill Gates. So one variable can change a lot. So that's more on an Avalanche example of that later. So Mediocristan, for example, you could say yesterday's corn froze solid, cold fronts moved in. We can predict with reasonable accuracy that we don't have a wet slab problem, right? It's 20 degrees, flat light, and bulletproof. Yesterday's wet slab problem, we can use the data. We can also use data from past wet slab avalanche cycles, temperature data, all that stuff. So then we go to Extremistan. So in Extremistan, past events are useless. And he does use the word useless to predict future events. Further, prediction errors multiply and then render any predictions fallacy. It's kind of like if you are predicting and saying that you have accuracy, your errors will multiply beyond what you're even thinking about. Example of that coming up. A single variable can skew the whole picture, so that's Bill Gates and your group of 1,000. And then scaling factors and other nerdy stuff, and I'll leave those for now. But an example of this is there is a slope in Chamonix to go up Mont Blanc that people climb up in the summer. So there's 2 ways up Mont Blanc. They're both dangerous. Newsflash, it's not a walk up. One is dangerous because of rockfall. The other is a steep slope that is at high altitude, so it almost always has a persistent slab problem. And it has seracs above it. It's called the trois mots, the 3 bumps. And hundreds of people march up and down that thing, and about every 8 years, the seracs avalanche and kill 10 people. And everybody walks up it like it's totally normal. So that idea of a single variable can skew the whole picture. You have a persistent slab problem on a very steep, wide, planar slope. If a skier skis down that, they're not going to trigger an avalanche. You drop a serac on it, and it's a size 3.5. So one variable, how big is the trigger, has an enormous impact on the consequences. So it's Extremistan. First summer you go over there, you're like, man, everybody guides that. You walk up and you're like, I don't like this. And then the avalanche kills 2 of your friends, and you're like, that's actually Extremistan. It is completely unpredictable when the serac is going to fall. You could track weather, you could track wind, you could track snow stratigraphy. None of that is going to tell you when the avalanche is going to happen. That slope is Extremistan. Pull out my list of routes that I guide. Off. I can't predict, and the consequences aren't worth it. So that's a summer example, but it's an avalanche example. Another example of Extremistan, this is from Red Mountain Pass, or on the way up to it. So this is from teaching an Area 3 course, and we had a deep slab instability, which is awesome for that class, and we have 6 days of like heavy nerding. So all we're doing all day long is looking at the snow, talking about the avalanche problems, mapping it out, what aspects, what elevations, on and on and on. And by the end of the week, people are like, oh, we haven't seen any deep slab instability, and just psychologically, they want to take it off the list of problems. Even though everybody knows, they don't tell you that they're there. Lack of avalanche activity, not predictive to presence of problem. And then one morning, we're driving up to the pass, and this thing ran natural, size 3.5, it's a 15-foot crown. Like, no change in anything. No significant wind event. No significant temperature change. No precip. Like nothing. No critical values, nowhere, no how. So the idea of Extremistan is how far and how big is that avalanche going to break? We don't know. When is it going to happen? We don't know. Again, that idea, if that day is in, if your day out there resides in Mediocristan, your uncertainty is low. But if it's in Extremistan, whoops, your uncertainty is pretty high. And again, I'm not going, like there's so many other side topics here, but we're going to focus it on the two stands for now. So, mini case study, this was a group of professionals, and we have a complex avalanche problem. So there'd been storm slab, which had buried older wind slabs, and there was a deeper slab instability. And this is in the Pacific Northwest, so it's like not a normal thing. And this is a group of folks, we spend 10 days focusing on this. And in the last 2 days of that 10 days, we were trying to poke out of the alpine, but we had this visibility. The group is pretty complex, so it's a group of professionals, but nobody, you know, people don't know each other. They're coming in to take a course. So there's some new dynamics there. The terrain is very complex, steep, et cetera. And so we spent the 10 days in the trees. We never went above tree line. So there's also this, like, by day 9, everyone's like, ugh, if I have to walk around in the green out anymore, I'm going to lose my mind. So that's all building up. So we go for our overnight, and we had this plan where we could poke into the alpine to get up and over. So we went in 1,000 feet lower than we always have in that course, so we could stay below tree line. And then we're like, well, we can skin out to our high point, or we can ski out to our high point if we go up into the alpine for one bit. And we spend like the whole week nerding about the snow, and then we spend the whole day and the next day mapping out what are our uncertainties, where's the deep slab problem, what would it take to trigger it, are we in Mediocristan, are we in Extremistan? So we're talking explicitly about all of this stuff, trying to decide should we poke up into the alpine or not. Oops, went too far. I know, spoiler alert. So this is the camp the night before, and we in the end decide, all right, we're going to do it. We're feeling good about it, this aspect, this elevation. And we poke up into the alpine, and we ski. There's an exposed line. It's probably 800 vertical. It's not big. But you're out in the open, big planar slope. We kind of work a mini ridge. Everybody travels through it safely. It's all good. Come out, turn my phone on, and here's the picture from the neighborhood, Snoqualmie Pass, from the patrol at Alpental ski area. And they had been ski cutting to open some of the backcountry terrain. And they ski cut, no results. It's a big traverse. They ski out about 30 minutes to go out, ride the lift up. They come out again. Where they had ski cut slid natural, not when they ski cut it to that. So they come back after their first run and find this. Definitely Extremistan, right? And that was in the same cirque that we had decided to ski in the alpine. And they were on the north, and we were on an east. And I'm still like, was that a big enough margin? Still not sure about that, right? It all worked out fine. But in that environment, uncertainty is high. Past events are useless to accurately predict future events. We were trying to use past information about the deep slab instability to predict the future events. It had the risk of multiplying. You could argue it was essentially fallacy, right? So for us as backcountry decision makers, as professionals, I think the main takeaway that I'm going for is often we may not actually catch when we leave Mediocristan and stumble into Extremistan. So now you can sort of see how this is linking into this whole how we make decisions. how much of our travel, our experience, was in Mediocristan? How much of it was in Extremistan? And how is that going to affect the way we make decisions? Okay. So I wanted to zoom back, given those pieces of the cognitive picture, with a sort of general picture, stuff you all know. We are, in fact, human beings, so we can't leave this shit behind, right? The bias stuff applies to experts. We might have our own version of it, but we don't escape it. We don't get to point that to recreational travelers. So these cognitive biases can cause us to have blind spots. And again, this is like, I'm skipping the rock over that topic, right? If you have biases and expect behavior, that can cause a blind spot. It's like that classic thing. If you think that there's one woman in the group, you're going to be safer because you read McCammon's paper from 2001. But then it turns out that if everybody else is showing off, your risk exposure score actually might go up. Like, that's a bias that may cause you to turn your brain off and have a blind spot. So what I'm focusing on here is this idea of system 1, system 2. So our cognitive biases can cause us to have blind spots. Blind spots can then cause us to have errors in decision making. Problem is, we operate in a high-risk environment. So there's a relatively low chance of avalanche involvement. That's like in the plus column. Most of the time, we are lucky. That was the Avalanche Review's cover. I loved it. Are we smart or are we lucky, right? So low chance most of the time, but the consequences are super high. So as the years add up, as we have our risk exposure build, this idea of all this stuff, cognitive biases, we're going to have blind spots. We operate in high risk, and the consequences are not acceptable. So you could take the perspective that we are going to screw up. You can't avoid it. You're always going to bring the humans. And you're in a high-risk environment. So what do you do about that? Specific overlay from tonight, blind spots, systems. System 2 is slow and burdensome. I haven't even talked about all the other stressors, right? Life, work, family, stress, fatigue, distraction. All it takes is one distracted day. It's always a high-risk environment. It might be lower or higher risk depending on the day, but it's always there. It doesn't stop being a risky situation. So we're the ones who change. Our ability to focus on that and to manage it is what fluctuates. Okay, so quick moment. You can write it down, tap it in your phone, think about it. What do we do about this? So literally, take 1 minute, have a think, see if you can come up with something that you have seen or heard or done to deal with this situation. The risk doesn't go away, the people fluctuate. What do we do about it? I'm going to set a timer. Okay, so the thing that you thought about, hold it in your mind. We're going to come back to it. For this talk, I actually thought about ending now. And the reason why is because I don't think we have this figured out. But I have a few things that have come up from sessions like this that I wanted to share. And then also, hopefully you all can add or compare to what you've been thinking about. So when we talk about what we can do about it, the main sort of Kahneman point is to actually focus on building system 2 processes and supporting those processes. So in our case, that is the idea of managing your risk system-wide. You're not one human trying to figure this all out. You're tapping into a whole bunch of resources. And by system-wide, it means what you're doing before you're making the decisions, what you're doing in the moment, how you review after it. So whether it is in an actual system, you have a team of professionals who gather information, review the information, come up with a forecast, gather data, compare the forecast, come up with an assessment, repeat, right? System-wide. Or whether you're doing that as an individual, but building other resources, other humans to talk to. The second one, this is like I really wish we could do this, because I keep hearing about what people do versus what they say. And what we value and what our actual goals are. So building and supporting a culture of conservatism. And initially my beef was with the sort of ski movie culture for recreationalists, which is like, we're supposed to go do the things we see in the movies. So the second I get skins and trackers, I'm gonna like clack up the hill and go huge. And then the beacon manufacturers and the avalanche safety gear people are gonna be like, here's gear, you'll be safe. It's like borderline unethical, right? So that was my initial beef. But now I'm talking about professionals. And I still hear all the time, like individuals saying, I see this happening in my community, I don't like it, I don't understand, and I don't want to say anything about it because X, Y, Z, P, Q, R, S, T. Whether it's conflict between individuals, entities, pride, whatever it is. That culture of conservatism, we don't have it. We have it in pockets, for sure we have it in pockets. And it's getting better, but minimizing the garbage in, garbage out. And there's a bunch of different ways you can do this. Maybe it's the reviewing the day honestly, like, did we nail it? Oh yeah, we totally nailed it. Sweet, cheers. Not super helpful. But it can also be this idea of your emotional muscle memory. So if you don't ever look at consequence, you don't have impact, you don't have intact intuition. So whether it is watching the Tunnel Creek thing at the beginning of every year, Human Factor 2.0, whether it's vicarious or personal, how you add information about consequence. And I have that as its own bullet. I didn't talk about that at all tonight because it's a whole other thing. The reason why we're able to function is because we disassociate consequences if we're wrong. That's why we can do what we do. And you get folks who come from the outside who are like, why the hell do you do what you do? Because my God, they can't disassociate that consequence. As professionals, we get maybe a little too good at doing that. So having consequence at the table is another way to sort of help mitigate. One of the big ones is the slowing down of decision making. And this isn't just Kahneman, this is coming from a lot of high-risk decision making folks, is the way that you can trim errors is slow it down. How many folks have ever used a run list? A run list. So the idea that you decide indoors with a group of professionals staring at your computers what you're going to ski and what you're not going to ski before you're in the terrain. So I've been using a run list for sort of 5 to 10 to 7 years-ish, and each year I still get more depth about how it mitigates this stuff. So you come in thinking a run list is good for reasons A, B, and C. You use it for five years, and all of a sudden a run list is good for A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, like it's a powerful tool. One of the things that it does is it slows down your decision-making process. You agree, as a group of people, what you're going to ski and not ski before you get out there. Tell you what, folks who haven't used a run list hate this idea. They're like, no, I want to go look and decide. And you're like, sweet, you just rolled up your system 2 into a ball and like, chucked it out the window. It is not hanging out with you that day. If your go look is your plan. So a run list is one of the ways you can do that. The idea, the rules of that are that if you see something, you close it in the morning, you get out, you like it, you can open it tomorrow. It adds a 24-hour slowdown to your decision-making process. So any way that you can slow down that, you're going to be able to overlay your system 2. One of the other things that Kahneman talks about is leading with the system 2. So go through your checklist, and then at the end, do your gut check. What do I really think about this? And he's actually done a bunch of stuff that you end up with a more accurate outcome in some situations if you lead with a checklist and then deploy intuition. So the point isn't that you just ignore your intuition, but that you lead with system 2 and then do a check with system 1. The stay scared thing has been you ask the people who've been doing this for 25 years, what's your secret? And the stay scared, that idea is like, do you walk around the mountains visualizing where the avalanche would start, how big it would propagate, and where it would run to? Try it if you don't. It really helps you with your terrain selection. So stay connected to consequence. And then use margins. And this one gets its own slide because we are gonna screw it up. We can't leave the humans behind. So does your margin need to be one aspect to another? Can't you just make it a bigger margin? And this ties into that culture of conservatism. It makes it really hard to apply very large margins when you're hanging out in Extremistan. I'm still not sure that our margin was large enough on that day, where we punched it into the Alpine and it all worked out fine. Like, did it again, I would have an even bigger margin. If you're in Mediocristan, you don't need to have as much of a margin. It's not like you always have to have a giant margin. Closing slide. The trick with all of this, second to closing slide, you'll note there's two sets of asterisks. So the other thing that the cognitive behavioral people will tell us is talks don't change behavior. Even taking a class doesn't change behavior. You don't change behavior in an hour or 1 day or 2 days or 3 days. That stuff takes time. They do tell us that like emotional experiences help change behavior. Reading statistics doesn't change behavior. Reading a case study that's very well presented and you're tearing up will actually remind you of consequence better than reading that this percentage of people died in this avalanche conditions. And then the last asterisk is this is the tip of the iceberg. So for those of you who thought a minute and wrote something down, towards the behavioral change, if you leave here with one thing for this year that you're going to do different, one thing. I know it's the end of the year, but it's only mid-April. We got one, it's a good snow year up north. If you have one intentional thing and you can do it and add it to your repertoire, that's actually how you change behavior. Sometimes. Cool, thanks you guys.